Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles podcast. This is Len Edgerly, and this is the show for Saturday, November 4th, 2023. I'm recording in Sanibel, Florida. We're back on Sanibel after spending the summer up in Maine, and it's good to be back. I wish there had been more progress toward repairing some of especially the condo buildings along the Gulf Coast of the island. It just seems like the progress is very slow. One of the guys we play pickleball with said, it could be another 5 years before the island is really back to what it was before Hurricane Ian struck on September 28th of 2022. But it sure is good to be back here, and we're looking forward to reconnecting with all the various activities and people that we've grown to love here on the island of Sanibel. Yesterday, November 3rd, I spoke with New York Times book critic Dwight Garner about his new book, Upstairs Delicatessen, on eating, reading about eating, and eating while reading. It's a unique book. It's almost like a book of quotations, which is what his previous book, Garner's Quotations, was back in 2020. And he's going to talk about it. You'll get a feel for the book in our conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it and recommend it highly. Dwight grew up in West Virginia. He was born in Fairmont, West Virginia. And then I think when he was about 8 years old, his family moved to Naples, just down the coast here from Sanibel, and went to school there in Naples. He went to college in Vermont at Middlebury College, where he majored in American literature. After college, he worked as a reporter and an editor for several newspapers and magazines, including the Vermont Times, the Boston Phoenix, that's one I read back in the day, an alternative weekly in Boston, and Harper's Bazaar. There have been a number of rave reviews, and I'll have links to them in the show notes, but one in particular I noticed was from the Times Literary Supplement in London, the TLS. Adam Begley wrote, speaking of Dwight, "He's not given to boasting, so I'll say it for him. For the past decade or so, he has been the most influential book critic in America, a mainstream media paragon." Well, that's quite a statement coming all the way from London. And in addition to writing for the New York Times, Dwight has contributed to Harper's, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, among other publications. He's appeared on NPR's All Things Considered and the PBS NewsHour. With that, I'm happy to share my conversation with you, my conversation with Dwight, who was at his home in Manhattan when we spoke yesterday by Zoom. I have read the book, but I remember, I think you mentioned on the book review podcast from one of your times with Sam Tannenhouse about, I thought you had been handed an author interview for a book you hadn't read, and that you came up with this way to open the conversation. But it looks like Charlie Rose did that when he had somebody. Yeah. All right. In any event, I love asking, this is the first question, your book, why now?
It's funny. I was actually working. This was during COVID, and I was working on another book. Forgive me, but you could hear some sirens outside my window. But that's New York City for you. I was living in West Virginia for a year, working on a different sort of book, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But COVID happened, and it sort of got in the way of my reporting. And I needed something else to write. And I talked to my editor, Jonathan Galassi at Farage, Dawson Giroux, and I suggested this amorphous food book. And it's a hard book to describe, right? But he got it, and I'm really glad he did. So it was fun to write.
And so that's how it started, and that's why now. Let's just describe the book for my listeners to give them an idea of what's in it and what might appeal to them.
Yeah, it's sort of part memoir. The book's title is The Upstairs Delicatessen. And that phrase comes from the late, great literary critic Seymour Krim, who described his own memory as this profuse upstairs delicatessen of mine. And I've always loved that phrase, because we all have these upstairs delicatessens, our memories. And the subtitle of my book is on eating, reading, reading about eating, and eating while reading. And so it's part memoir, it's part, my life is told through food up to a point. But, my life isn't that goddamned interesting. So I sort of branched out, and after doing memoir for about 40 pages, I walked through a day in my life. So I walked through breakfast, through lunch, through shopping, through drinking, through dinner. There's a bit on naps in there too, and swimming. But as I walk through my day, I talk about it, and I talk about in the morning how I make coffee and how other writers have thought about coffee and made their coffee, or tea, and what Orwell had to say about tea, and what Christopher Hitchens had to say about tea, and eggs, and on throughout the day. And I bring in other literary voices while talking about my own life.
And I've heard you say that this all comes out of a commonplace book that you've kept since you were very young. Talk a little bit the process of getting something from the commonplace book to this book.
Well, since I was young, whenever I found a great line in a novel or even a magazine, whatever I'm reading, I've tended to write it down. And I have this huge commonplace book now. It's just a collection of quotations, but they're sort of, devoted now to every subject, under the sun. I mean, there's one on cars, there's one on travel, there's one on social class, there's one on parties, violence, war, women, men, and I've written all these down, and I love food so much that a large part of what I kept were food quotations, just bits that I loved. And, I'm kind of a quotation snob in the sense that I don't like the same old quotations. I'm tired of everyone using the same 11, or not 11, the same 200. And I just feel like there's this wildness out there. We need better quotations in this world. And I've sort of devoted my life in part to finding them and hoping to popularize them. Good things people have said. I'm a fan. I love good writing and good observation about the world.
And your Garner's Quotations book, that was clearly the kind of quotations that you talk about. They're kind of spicy and snarky sometimes, and funny and dark. And there's a few inspiring ones. I found a couple that snuck in that were sort of upbeat.
Yeah, my idea was to do a book of quotations that had no uplift whatsoever. I mean, there's a little bit in there, of course, because I'm not a depressing sort of goth character. I like uplift too, but every quotation, every time you go to a bookstore, there's like there's quotations on bookmarks and things. They're always sort of banal things about, the same 9 things about being happy. And I don't know, I want better bookmarks. I want better things to be sold in bookstores with funnier quotes on them. So I've heard my book described, my quotations book, as sort of like Bartlett's on tequila, and which is a gross way to describe it, but it kind of gets it across a little bit.
Yeah. When you were putting that book together, it looks like some of the same quotes got into the new book, but were you envisioning a book about food when you were putting together the quotations book? Did the quotations book in some ways lead to this book a few years later?
Maybe not really. It just sort of came about. I mean, it's funny. There's so many things I would like to write about, and one of the great things about being a book critic is that you do get to write about different things every week. And I look at my quotations sometimes, the ones I've kept, and I think about the books that I might want to write about other topics. Because once you've gathered this great chorus of great things that have been said about something, it sort of feeds your own thoughts and leads to like Edmund Wilson writing to the Finland station or something. It leads to a larger synthesis about how you see the world, to bring in other voices and be able to bounce off them and whatever.
I would think you might have enough quotes in that commonplace book now, you're in your late 50s, to last the rest of your life writing books. Do you ever worry about continuing to add to the commonplace books because you'll never catch up to yourself?
Yeah, well, I still add every day. I mean, I'm reading a book today, and when I'm done, I will type up the best bits into my commonplace. It's just a habit, of mine, and I don't know. I enjoy it. It's one of the better parts of my day, and I'm a big believer in, all of us with our jobs, the things we care about, the important work we do. We often don't have the mojo that day. Like, it's hard to write every morning. Some days I don't really feel like writing or doing anything serious, but I do have the energy to work on my commonplace book for a little bit. So it's a great fallback activity. And I think the fallback activities in life are often as important as the main thing you're driving at. It's important to have something good to do on the side that matters to you and that interests you when you're not doing the thing that is your thing.
Do you always enjoy working on the commonplace book, or is it now just a habit that you pick up without even deciding whether or not you're going to do it?
It's both. It's a habit. And I have a little pile of books on the floor that are waiting for me to mind them because I've underlined in them. They're waiting for me to go get to them and add the best bits. But I enjoy it. I really do. I really enjoy it. I don't know why. I have this crazy idea that, after I'm long gone, someone will find it and publish it as kind of an anti-Bartlett's, but it will need a lot of cleaning up before that would happen. And I doubt it will happen. So but it's a dream of mine.
Well, you mentioned your work as a book reviewer, and I think that you have assigned a lot of book reviews for the Sunday Times, which uses the freelancers. And if you had been assigning someone to review your book, who would have you chosen and why?
Oh God, that's brutal. I would have chose the woman who reviewed it because she did such a lovely job. Her name is Jennifer Reese, and she's a critic that I've been aware of for a long time. She's very talented, but she's also written about food and about baking. And she wrote such a lovely review of my book. And it's funny, I mean, of course, every critic wants a positive review, but when it's so well written and so articulate and tells you things about your own book you couldn't have even thought of yourself, this is a special review that I got from her. So I'm really sort of in awe of the review I got. And I would have liked it even if she had just said something banal like, this book is compelling and I loved it. I would have even liked that. But to have someone really be smart, that was really special. So I feel lucky to have had her review my book.
I thought one phrase in her review that I noticed was she talks about your book's ethos of gusto. Is that something that surprised you, or you recognized it as a way to describe the book?
It's true. And yet the thing I love most when she described me as a sort of domesticated gusto man or domesticated, I love the novels of Jim Harrison. And I talk about Jim Harrison being this ultimate embodiment of gusto. He just went for it in every aspect of his life. I knew him just a teeny bit, enough to know that he was a man of big appetites. But I'm also just a shy guy who stays in most nights, and I live with gusto. My idea of gusto was often making 2 martinis and cooking some weird thing and enjoying my music. And, it's a very low key, mild sort of gusto, but I like it,
It's a restrained gusto.
Exactly.
Maybe it's a refined gusto.
Approachable gusto.
Yes. What do you think makes a good book review?
Oh, God. Specificity. A lot of specificity. I think a good humor helps. I don't mean cracking jokes, but it should be kind of a wit that crackles through it. I think in a good book review, you got to give readers a sense of the book enough so that they can make their own judgments. And part of that means quoting from it well, because you can't really believe a review that doesn't quote much of the book. If there's a passage that illustrates why a book is awful or why it's good, it's nice to print that. So it's always good to have some quotation, but I just want to be provoked a little bit. I want to be made to think of something. I want to be made to smile, perhaps. When I pick up the New Yorker, I always slip right to the back because I know Anthony Lane will be there with one of his film reviews. And he's just so charming. I'm not even sure that I agree with him. I'm not sure we have the same taste even. I don't care. He's just reliably puts me in a better mood when I read him, and he makes me think of things. And I hope that on some level I do that for readers. Because I know what I like in a critic, and he has a lot of that.
Hmm. Do you remember reading the New York Times book review when you were young?
Yeah, I mean, I really read. No, I mean, I'll say no. I started reading it in college. That's when I started reading the New York Times. I didn't really know about the New York Times, so I went to Middlebury College, and the Times had a program then, probably still does, where you get a deep discount if you're a student. So you could get it delivered every day for very little money, whatever it was, and I just became addicted to it, And the book review I started reading it about then, but it never. Frankly, I was more interested in reading Maureen Dowd on politics at that point in my life, and the other critics, dance and music and film. And I feel like I could have gone in other directions as a critic. Not movies. I love movies, but I don't feel like I have the vocabulary or the taste for movies. But I would have liked to have written about music or dance. I'm a big fan of. And anyway, I just feel, but the great thing about books is, as I've said, that it changes every week. So it's just a new topic, which is delightful for the mind.
What about, did you ever think about being a restaurant critic?
Oh, yes. I'm glad you brought that up. I would have loved that. Although, I really enjoy a good restaurant review. Here's the thing, though. I live with this woman, my wife, Creela Favor, who grew up in a restaurant family, and she really knows food inside and out. She knows it on a cellular level because she grew up with it. And I'm a Johnny-come-lately to food. And she's a super taster, and I'm around her sometimes, and I'll take a bite of something. And go, what is that? And she'll peel off the 4 distinct, flavor waves in a single bite in each successive act on the tongue. And I'm just like, my God, a food critic should have that ability, I think, although you can be pretentious with it. But I don't think I'm a good enough taster to really do it properly, but it'd be fun to try.
Do you think some people actually have different experiences in their mouth or just given more sensors on their tongue than others?
I do. I think that's been proven, A. And B, she's been around food so long that she just understands that, and she just knows primarily that, this whatever this dish is, you're not supposed to make it with X, you're supposed to make it with Y. And not necessarily criticize it for that, because if it's good, it's good. But it's important to know that traditionally it's made this way versus this way when you first taste it. And I don't think I have that level of sophistication. I hope that I'm pretty good at tasting, but I live with someone who's too good, so I get scared.
What's the most memorable blowback you've gotten from a review that an author just didn't like or was offended by?
God, it's funny. It's very seldom that this happens. I mean, I've been in rooms where someone wouldn't shake my hand, that sort of thing. Where you run up and let me introduce you to X, and it turns out that I've reviewed X, maybe not positively. So that's happened. Nothing. There's no crazy story where someone, I think Burt Reynolds famously, or Ryan O'Neal famously dumped like a helicopter load of horse shit on some critic's house or something. The stories like that you hear, they're out there, and nothing like that has ever happened to me. Anything like it. The literary world is full. It's filled with gamesmanship, and sometimes you feel that, you've knocked a certain cue ball that maybe hit a different cue ball, and you're getting some blowback from this weird corner that you didn't expect because these angles, and you can make yourself crazy trying to work out what those angles are. But no, luckily I don't. I'm not for the most part a taker of scalps. I mean, I can be pretty negative, but when I am negative, I hope to see the good things in a book. And I'm rarely negative about a first novel or a first book that didn't have much going for it in the first place, because the last thing you want to be is the kind of critic who says to the reader, this book you never heard of, well, it's terrible. Because who cares? They're not going to find that book anyway. So if I'm writing a negative review, normally it's someone who has a reputation and their career is kind of set, and I can't really do them epic harm. Although, any review in the New York Times carries a lot of freight, just because the New York Times is what it is, A, and B, because book reviews in this country have really nearly become extinct. They're still out there, but it used to be every daily newspaper had a book critic, and all these alternative weeklies and Time magazine review mattered, and Newsweek's mattered, US Today, your US News World Report mattered. All these things are gone now, and so there are just so fewer critics that the New York Times review means too much. I wish that, frankly, there were more critics still out there, so reviews didn't exist in quite the vacuum they do now.
I thought you put it in the context of other books that you've admired by hers, including Machine Dreams, 1984, which you praised as catching the vibe of West Virginia in a way no novel has. And you said you hope people buy it. I bought it. I bought a copy of Machine Dreams based on your recommendation in that. Did you hear from her, or can you tell me a little bit more about that review in particular?
No, it's funny. I've been. She's almost the writer who means more to me than any writer alive, even though I only like her first two books. And this happens, a lot of. For example, let's think about Joni Mitchell, the Blue and Court and Spark, for example, or if she'd only done those, she would still be, one of the greatest singer-songwriters of our time. And I feel that way about Jayne Ann. I don't like her recent work, but who cares? She's still. I still, I will love her until I die. But I had read all of her books, because I'm from West Virginia as well, and I've kept up with her, but never reviewed them, because I didn't want to come out and say these negative things that I wanted to say about her work, which I think it's become pretentious over time. And I finally said, fuck it, I'm going to say it, and I'm sure she didn't enjoy my review. At the same time, her book's nominated for the National Book Award. She's won every prize known to man. She is a made writer. Nothing I could do will hurt her stature in the world of letters. But I just had, it was time for me to say what I wanted to say, and I did. And I think that I also, though, said many nice things about her. So it's a complicated review to write.
I think I heard somebody say at the Times that generally they don't publish a negative book review because there's so many books. Why do that? But I guess there is a role for a negative review. How do you understand when it's worth the Times using its powerful platform to put a review out that's quite negative?
It's a complicated question. I don't think the Times shies away from negative reviews. I will say that the book review tends to be more positive than it might be, because the book review uses so many freelancers. And by freelancers, I mean other writers. And so a lot of other writers out there, other novelists, are assigned another novel to review, and they're all in the same guild, and it's hard for them to tear down another writer. So often the reviews are more positive. When I was an editor at the book review, it was very frustrating, because I would send a book to a writer, and I would call them up and say, "What'd you think?" And they would say, this book was a piece of shit. And then the review would come in, and the review would be just all sort of vaguely positive, plot summary, and what happened, And I feel a strong impulse as a critic to say what I feel, to speak to a reader as if I were speaking to a friend. And negative reviews are important. I mean, you have to bulldoze the bad to make way for the good to bloom in literary culture, like any other culture. A and B, I get a lot of grateful emails when I write a negative review because I think the literary world has gotten so positive in its criticism that readers feel often that they've been hoodwinked. You know, every book is this great new book, and they buy the book, and it's not so great. And so I think readers are glad to have me enable them to cross one off their list once in a while.
When you're preparing an author interview, there's people, I think Sam Tannenhouse, maybe Charlie Rose, often didn't read the book, didn't prepare. It was more of a spontaneous encounter with someone. It makes for a lively conversation. But where are you on that spectrum in terms of preparing for an actual live interview with an author? What do you do to get ready?
Well, two things. One, I don't do them anymore. I mean, I haven't done them for a while because now that I'm a critic, I go out of my way not to meet writers because it doesn't help them and it doesn't help me. If I get to know you and we all become chummy, it's hard for me to review you. Maybe I can't review you anymore. So I don't hang out with writers very often. And if I do hang out with a writer, and let's say I have a drink or someone invites me to a dinner and there's a writer, we kind of hit it off and maybe, hey, let's do this again. I have to say to them, look, if I see you more than one more time after this, I just got to tell you, I can't review your work anymore. So you decide, you know. But as an interviewer, I'm an over preparer. Unlike Sam Tannenhouse was a great interviewer. He would just show up and start asking questions, you know, about the topic and the title and how long it took you to write it. And yeah, he was very good at that. And I'm not the kind of person I can do that. I mean, I've been around long enough that you do interviews, you learn what to ask a writer. But I tend to over prepare.
There's quite a bit of sex in this book, which I enjoyed. I wondered how you saw the role of the sexual references from other writers and sex and food and all of that, and if there were any sexual items that Cree or anyone else said, no, that's too far, that's when it's a little poor taste, or...
Yeah, I lost a few things for people thought I pushed it too far, and I'm glad they told me but you know, sex is part of life. Sex is one of the great parts of life, and food and sex, they borrow from the same stock of language, the same stock of imagery. There's a lot of this is cardinal sense of what life is, and you know, I love fiction and nonfiction that's filled with human appetite, you know, and so I like good sex and fiction, realistic, that matters and has layers to it, and food descriptions are the same way, and they go together. You know, I write in my book that as we all age, food becomes sexual compensation, you know, because a lot of us don't have sex as often as we did when we were 25, you know, but here's food, you know, food's not a bad, food can fill some gaps in your life. But I don't know, you know, it actually a lot of food memoirs and food books have a lot to say about sex in them. So it wasn't just me having this idea that these two things went together. It's a sort of common thread.
Right. You said one reason any person becomes a book critic is the hope of discovering a new talent. Are there any discoveries that you've made in your time of reviewing books that particularly stand out that you were glad you were able to shine a light on someone's work and they went on to become someone that was greatly loved?
Well, maybe. I'll think about that. The problem is, you know, it wasn't so much often that I discovered them because most of them are published already by someone who discovered them first, and they probably would have done fine without me. I'm just trying to think of a writer that I think I really gave a special push to. I mean, I was there early there's a young generation of female writers who were just brilliant, like Sheila Heti, you know, Tesha Moshfegh, and Catherine Lacey, and they're all very interesting, sometimes dark, complicated writers, very much of the moment. And I feel like I was lucky to be there early in their careers to see what they were doing and to talk about it. Once in a while, I've reviewed a book that was self-published in a few cases that I feel lucky to have found a book. One book was written by a bookseller who only sells books about military books. She has a bookstore devoted to military books, and she wrote a memoir about that. It was really fascinating. And I don't know, I'm sure there's some others I can't think of.
You mentioned that there have been some times that Cree has had a chance to read one of your reviews, I guess, while you're writing it, and she has given you some advice. When you've listened to it, you've been glad you did. There was a time that you didn't listen to her advice, that it turned out afterward you wished you had taken it into account more?
Oh God, yes. Matter of fact, I'm not even going to tell you the story because then people go find the review that I feel like I really blew. But well, once or twice I've written things that I wish I could retract. I'm sure that if someone, it probably will happen someday. Someone will decide to write a piece about Dwight Garner's, like, not the greatest hits, but the inverse of that, like the dumbest things Dwight Garner's ever written. And you can probably make a piece out of that, because if you have 1,000 bylines in the New York Times, a few of them are going to just kind of, you're going to, like, the ball's going to go off the field and into the stands once in a while. And I've done that. So
no need to give any more emphasis on
right.
That'll be someone else's job. You said, this might have been from the quotes book, you need to be careful about using words for the first time in print. And then I think somewhere else it's, people can tell when you're using a word as a writer that you haven't quite made your own yet. And it struck me that how do you hear that if you're reading someone's writing, or what are the symptoms that someone hasn't quite got a word into their own personal voice yet, and it kind of stands out like a nail that needs to be pounded more?
Yeah, no, you can sort of feel it when you sense a writer with the thesaurus open next to the laptop. It just, so I mean, a lot of writers use complicated words and use them well and use them all the time. It sort of fits into their prose, but sometimes you'll be reading a writer whose prose is otherwise kind of clear and simple, and there's some crazy word that sticks out, like an enormous weed, and where did that come from? So there's if you're going to use complicated language, big words, it's got to fit the tone of your writing somehow. I mean, you're kind of the person who uses those words. You know how to use them, and it can seem showy. I mean, William F. Buckley used to be famous in his columns. He had a syndicated column. He sort of made a fetish out of using two enormous words in every review. And you sort of knew that was his shtick, and he probably did know them, but sometimes I feel like he probably was just opening the thesaurus just to, like, show his readers that he was a cut above the rest. Anyway.
You mentioned somewhere that every novel is about aging, and I'm 73 now, and I'm thinking about aging probably more often than you do in your 50s. But I found myself saying, really, what do you mean by that every novel is about aging?
Well, nostalgia, memory, time, the passage of time. I mean, those are the sort of great themes in literature. Even if you're writing YA novels, I mean, the graduation from 8th grade to high school is one of the great markers in one's life. So the passage of time, aging, and we all have a different sense of it as we get older. It really starts to hit you. I'm 58. I'm younger than you are, but you start to realize, some of your friends aren't doing so well anymore, and it makes you assess your own life. And anyway, I just think that fiction, if there is a primal theme in fiction, or if there are a handful of primal themes, that's certainly one of the most important ones.
Well, this is the Kindle Chronicles. I used to ask people this a lot more 15 years ago when I started this, but have you ever read ebooks on a Kindle or other device? I take it you're pretty much a guy on paper when you're reading.
Yeah, I do. I do buy Kindle books. I use them often. It's sort of last minute. I'm writing something and I need to, let's say, refer to a writer's earlier book. And I'll go back and get it on Kindle and read it really quickly on Kindle. And I do download Kindle stuff a fair amount. The reason I don't do it more often is that I'm a big underliner. I just find it, even though I know you can do it and you can underline, I find it a little difficult. I never go back and get my notes, and they kind of get lost to me. And I'm just an old fuddy-duddy. But I'm waiting for a really good e-reader that allows you to take really good notes and write things in the margins. And I know there's one or two out there, but I've yet to be shown that they would be useful to me. But I'm on the lookout.
Yeah, the Kindle Scribe I thought was going to be a lot closer to that. But the problem is that if you want to write in the margins of a Kindle book, it's got a nice big 8x10 screen. I've got your book on it.
Yeah.
The only way you can do it is you highlight the passage, and then you tap to make a note, and you can either type the note on the little keyboard or you can write it longhand, which is kind of a nice step forward. And then you can see all of your longhand written notes within the book. But I don't know why. I think the problem with actually annotating on it is that you can change the font size. So if you annotate on it, and then you decide you're on a Paperwhite versus the Scribe, and you make it bigger, the annotations have to be able to flow as you change the font size. And I expect Amazon at some point is going to solve that. And at that point, And the Scribe, I just love writing my journals. It's just a whole new type of Kindle that is getting to where it sounds like you hope it gets to.
Yeah, I suspect I'll move in that direction at some point, but I don't know. I mean, James Wolcott, the critic, described a few years ago something he called the vanishing. Right? We all got rid of our albums first, then our CDs went out the door because I used to have hundreds and hundreds of CDs, and now I just have Spotify. I gave them all away, and I think that the hoarder in me wants to keep my books. I don't know. Physical books, I think I'm going to stick with them, but
you don't want just 3 Kindles on a nice bookshelf like the one behind you.
Yeah, right. I can see that being kind of groovy looking, but I don't know.
Returning to your reviews in the Times, I think they get published every Tuesday. You have a deadline of Friday. What's your rhythm? Once you turn it in, do you take the weekend off, or what's sort of the timeline of getting from the end of one review to the next when you're on a weekly schedule?
Yeah, I file either Thursday or Friday. I'm actually supposed to file on Thursdays. I try to, but sometimes it becomes Friday. Take a big nap. I file. Writing takes. I mean, I think as you get older too, it takes more out of me than it used to. I'm kind of exhausted, because I write my reviews in one sitting. It takes me 4 or 5 hours. I can do it in 2 sometimes if it's a really somehow I just hit my stride, but it takes usually 4 or 5 hours. That includes fact checking and rereading and blah blah blah. But then I'm on to what's next. I'm one of those people who likes what I do. My kids are now grown, and I probably work 7 days a week, but only 4 or 5 hours a day some days. But I'll the next day I'll pick up the next book I'm going to review, and I'll start reading it. But some weeks are brutal because maybe I'm reviewing someone's 3rd novel and I haven't read the first 2. So the next day I'll pick up the first 2 and have to read those first. And it could be a really busy week. Because as we all know, most of us can read the average book in about 8 hours, just average. And, but it's hard to read 8 hours a day. That's it's physically taxing to read for 8 hours. So some days I have to do that and it's hard. But yeah, I get right onto my next review.
Who are some of your favorite poets? Talk a little bit about what role poetry's had in your reading life.
Oh God, there's so many. I really, I feel lucky to have. I came somewhat late to poetry, but it matters to me. I mean, I love Kay Ryan, former poet laureate. I love August Kleinzahler. Kay Ryan writes these sort of skinny, smart, wise, satirical, punchy poems. August Kleinzahler is this sort of brawler from New Jersey who also writes the London Review of Books, and that in his own way is a serious intellectual. But he has this kind of Bukowski meets I don't know who Proust vibe about him. And Louise Glick, the poet who just died, I love the sort of darkness, almost the Bob Dylan Blood on the Tracks quality of her poetry. There's a Brit named James Fenton who doesn't write much poetry anymore, but he's an Oxford professor of poetry, or was. And his poems are they rhyme. I misrhyme. And they're witty and rhyming. People like that.
Did you ever get to know John Ashbery in New York?
I met him once, but no, I didn't know him. And I wouldn't want to know him. I mean, I doubt that I wouldn't want to know him, but I go out of my way not to meet writers, Right. Although at the time I was an editor, but I did meet him, but I don't know him. He was elderly by then.
Yeah. You lived in West Virginia when you were a boy, and then you moved to Naples, not too far from where I'm on Sanibel. And if you had to live the rest of your life in Florida or West Virginia, which would you choose?
Oh, it's brutal. I mean, I'm sort of professionally anti-Florida, which rubs my parents the wrong way because they took us there, and I had a nice childhood. I don't want to put down. I enjoyed Naples for the most part. The problem was that I was an indoor kind of young man in an outdoor state where every day people were saying, it's gorgeous out, go outside and play. And I didn't want to go outside and play. I want to stay in with my books, right? So I don't love my Florida hometown, Naples, only because it's just grown so big and it's gotten so, filled with really wealthy retirees. And I found it sort of, I don't know, I find it oppressive. But my point is that there are still really funky parts of Naples in the old downtown areas, and Florida is filled with funky parts. Even out on Sanibel has its funk. And So I could live in define funk how you will, but I wouldn't want to live in one of these wealthy suburban like cities, which are basically Ohio imported down to Florida. Um, but I do like northern Florida, where it's more like the South.
Hmm.
But anyway, I think I would pick West Virginia. I don't know. It feels I have problems with West Virginia. I mean, it's hard because the state it's not a place where you can find a lot of bookstores and a lot of cult. And I'm a culture guy. I love going out at night to see plays and music, and it's hard to find that in West Virginia unless you're in Charleston, and to a lesser degree in Morgantown. But even in Charleston, it's there's not a lot, and it's hard to find often. The supermarkets aren't as good as they are in some other places. And if you're like me and really want to shop really well and go out and see good things, it's hard in West Virginia.
Mm.
But there's something about the landscape that really speaks to me, and I just feel like that's my place. And I would choose to live in West Virginia. I could be happy there.
Mm. What would you like your last meal to be?
Oh God. I think I maybe wrote about this in my book. I think. But I think I wrote that I would just want some simple but good mozzarella and tomato to start and people tend not to know what real fresh mozzarella is because most people haven't tasted it. But if you buy the stuff when it's warm and just made and never been chilled, it's a whole different animal. It just sort of like drips all over you like a ripe peach. It's just not the same thing. And if you've only had mozzarella that comes from the supermarket and it's cold, you haven't had real mozzarella. And the real thing is something special, and it's kind of hard to find. In New York, there are 8 or 9 places that sell it. And I love a roast chicken. My wife is really good at that, and so and maybe some oysters. But nothing, no ortolan or escargot or I don't know. Pretty simple.
And last question: have you ever thought of an epitaph for yourself, or if you were going to propose one, what would it be?
I don't know. I might be something along the lines of, he loved writers and writing and tried to tell other people about them, and tried to point the way to some good stuff. And maybe in my book too, some good stuff in terms of the literature of food.
I have been speaking with Dwight Garner, the author of Upstairs Delicatessen. Thanks a lot, Dwight. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. That was fun.
I realized as I was going through the interview and preparing links for the show notes that this ended up being one of the longest lists of links that I've had in 715 episodes of the podcast. And it sort of fits because as Dwight talked about his commonplace book and how he's collecting things that he just uses in various ways and now has used in this book and in previous books. So a conversation with him just is full of pointers toward all kinds of delights. And I tried to capture as many of them as I could in the show notes. And if you want to follow up on some of his curating of ideas and not just books, just music and everything else, go to thekindlechronicles.com and you'll see the links. As I prepared for my interview with Dwight, there were several other interviews that he'd done with others that I had a chance to listen to, and I realized he speaks quickly and he gives quite concise answers. So I realized, well, I've got about a half an hour. Turned out to be a little more than that, 35 minutes or so. I better have a lot of questions. So I typed out 4 pages of questions. And Jeremy, the guy that was setting up the interview for me, said, "Oh, you'll never get to all those questions." And I said, "Yeah, but I just want to make sure I have enough." And as we got toward the end, I was glad I had all those questions because I was just about to run out of questions. And it made for a different pace of conversation that I've often had with people, but as I listened to it, I just enjoyed listening to it. It was, I'd ask a question, he'd have an answer, then I'd have another question, and I don't know. It was it like tennis? Was it like pickleball? I don't know, but I sure did enjoy it myself, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. That's it for the Kindle Chronicles from the island of Sanibel, and I'm not sure who I'll be talking with next. I'm in a mode now where if I see something and I think there's a chance to get somebody in the show that would be of interest, I reach out and schedule an interview and fire up my microphone, and the rest of the time we're enjoying life on Sanibel and Florida in lots of other different ways. So as a semi-retired podcaster, I feel very grateful for this chance to talk talk with you and to share real treats like a chance to get to know Dwight Garner. Thanks for listening.